Yo tengo tantos hermanos que no los puedo contar. En el valle, en la montaña, en la pampa y en el mar. Cada cual con sus trabajos, con sus sueños. Cada cual con la esperanza delante, con los recuerdos detrás.
So this series that I'm exhibiting, Ecos y Transparencias, is a very personal photographic series, and it's very rich in many stories. I guess it all begins in the late 60s when my father was a journalist for leftist newspapers in Uruguay. And there was a democratically elected government, but it was for all intents and purposes a dictatorship. And they began to repress people in very intense ways, and shut down the leftist newspapers, any newspapers that would speak out against the human rights abuses that the government was enacting were shut down. And so my father, being a journalist, was arrested numerous times, and the last time he barely escaped with his life. He fled to Argentina, Peru, Chile, Mexico, Polynesia. His life story is really incredible. And finally he ended up getting refugee status in Canada. And that's where he met my mom, and I was born. In the mid-1980s, the dictatorship ended in Uruguay, and in 1990, the dictatorship ended in Chile. It was 12 years in Uruguay and almost 20 in Chile. And so when it was finally safe to go home, my father did so. He had a new partner, an Argentinian woman, and they returned to South America. And so we were separated for almost 30 years. I did a lot of personal work, a lot of healing around his absence in my life, and guilt around him leaving, because, you know, as a child, when one of your parents leaves, it's easy for you to think that it's your fault. And so I had done a lot of inner work in that way, but I hadn't really realized like how much I really missed having a father, and how much I wanted him in my life, like as a person, and not just like an out of reach archetypal father figure. And so like I'm a multidisciplinary artist, but I focus mostly on music, and I wanted to go into music therapy, and so I was like taking a summer class. And during this class, we had to do an assignment on a song that was meaningful to us. And the song that I chose was Los Hermanos by Atahualpa Yupanqui, an Argentinian songwriter. And I chose that song because it's the only song that I ever remember hearing in my father's home when I was a child. I remember like this moment standing in my room, just like frozen in my tracks, listening to this beautiful music and feeling that it was written especially for me, that Mercedes Sosa was singing to me. Because the song, in the chorus, it goes, "Yo tengo tantos hermanos que no los puedo contar, y una hermana muy hermosa que se llama Libertad." Like, I have so many brothers that I can't count, and a very beautiful sister named Freedom. And my name means free in Greek. So And I knew that my dad had been married numerous times and I couldn't keep track of how many brothers I had. And so I thought that this song was literally about me, that like Mercedes Sosa and I just had this like awesome connection through space and time. And she was like, anyways. So that's why I chose the song. And the last question on the assignment was like, we had to listen to it on repeat and just do like a stream of consciousness, like writing. And see whatever came up. And what came up for me was this really powerful vision. There was a red, parched desert and a dark figure approaching in the distance. And as we walked towards one another, I realized that it was my father. And this happened again and again, that we met. And sometimes I would fall to my knees crying, and sometimes we would take each other in our arms, and sometimes we would just stand tall and strong and look at each other eye to eye. And so after having that vision, something opened in me, and I realized that I really deeply missed him and that I wanted him in my life. And so I reached out to him, and I told him about my vision. And he was deeply moved and said, let's try, let's try to reconnect and be in each other's lives more and come to Uruguay. And so I did. The 10 days that I spent in Uruguay it was the most intense experience of my life. I've never lived through anything that shook me to the core more. It was 10 days of nonstop torrential rains. There was flooding, like highways were collapsing. There was a power outage that like spanned 4 countries. Like it was like the natural world was just like storming. And the same thing was happening inside. I was like reconnecting with my father after almost 30 years, hearing all of his incredibly powerful stories of living under the dictatorship, of being arrested, of having to flee, of going into exile. All these ancestral stories were coming up, and it was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. It was so intense that I could barely speak. I was muted by the intensity of the experiences, which has never happened to me before. And I automatically went to my camera for some reason. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was just like the only way that I could connect to my daily life without being completely overwhelmed. So it's kind of like the camera allowed me to like focus in on like one little microcosmic section of the world and be like, okay, all this craziness is happening, but here's a blade of grass, here's a shadow on the wall, here's a shape in the sand. And then what was even more incredible was that in looking at the photos later, there was so much that was revealed. It was like my shadow issues and like my inner fear, like and intense emotions and ancestral stories and pain of my family, like everything was being projected outwards onto the world. And then it was only through the lens of a camera that I was able to really see it in a way that was like somewhat safe, where I was somewhat protected from the intensity of it through that lens. And so that's why that's the name of the exhibit, because like Ecos refers to like these intergenerational, this trauma and these stories, the echoes of dictatorship and exile that carried on into our lives, and Transparencias because of the lens that allowed me to really fully see my experiences from a safe distance and also in like a revelatory way. So that vision with the dark figure in the distance absolutely was part of my journey to come to terms with my past. And little did I know that it wasn't just my past, but my entire family's past, our ancestors. And that can be seen throughout the photos. There's one especially that comes to mind where I went out to take I was like walking in the garden and I saw my shadow against the brick and I found it interesting, and so I started snapping shots of my shadow. And it wasn't until I got inside in a different light and looked over the photos that I realized that the position that I had been in and the angle of the light and shadow had created the figure of an angel. And in that moment, it cracked open my heart and I just started bawling because it was like my own childhood innocence had been revealed to me. It's like you can tell yourself for a lifetime that what happened wasn't your fault, but to really like feel it is a different thing. And for whatever reason, that photo that I had taken unaware of its significance was a huge part of my journey, and like the reverberations are still felt. My great-grandfather was Felisberto Hernandez. He was a Uruguayan pianist and writer, and considered the forefather of magical realism. And when my father was 16 and first started working at these leftist newspapers, he was working with Eduardo Galeano, who's a famous Uruguayan writer and journalist. So those are some of like the literary figures that are very present in our personal life. And then in the photos, okay, so picture this. So I've been on a 12-hour flight from Montreal to Montevideo, and you know, it's already this epic journey where I'm seeing my father and a lot of my family for the first time in almost 30 years. It's crazy. We have like one day of downtime, and then we go to Paysandú, which is in the interior, and we go to La Meseta de Artigas, which is this like national historical monument. And it's this beautiful plateau right on the river between Uruguay and Argentina, a very important historical place. And a friend of the family, Daniel Vidart, had just passed away, and we were going there for his memorial service. So Daniel was also a famous historian, anthropologist, writer, and this is like my second day in Uruguay, and you know, all the torrential rains, all the, you know, and then we're at a memorial service, and there's grief, and the clouds are hanging low, and there's vultures circling overhead. It was very ominous and powerful. And because Daniel is a well-known literary figure, and his wife is as well, Alicia Castilla. She's an Argentinian pot activist and writer, and so there are photos in the exhibit of her scattering his ashes into the wind, and of my father consoling her. And who was at the memorial service except José Pepe Mujica, who is the ex-president of Uruguay. And like my dad just mentions it super cash, you know, like, oh yeah, Pepe will be there. It's like, the Pepe? Like, are you serious? And there's the ex-president. And I'm like singing him a song and taking photos of him. So he's in the exhibit as well. And he has an incredible life story. All of these people, like you could do documentaries on every single one of them. He he was a Tupamaro. So when the dictatorship, there's like so many different stories that come into play, but the Tupamaros were leftist guerrillas that stood up to the dictatorship in place. And he was imprisoned, as most of them were, for 12 years. Throughout the whole length of the dictatorship, from 1973 to 1985, he was imprisoned. And he's been shot countless times. And he was the best president Uruguay ever had. He was president from 2010 to 2015, and he legalized marijuana, and he's just an incredibly progressive thinker, super philosophical, and anyways, a really inspiring soul. So yeah, those are some of the figures that are woven into our family stories and this exhibit as a consequence. So I've mentioned how the microcosmic worlds that I took photos of reflected back my inner world to me and revealed a lot. The natural world interacts with the people present in these photos in a very powerful way as well. You'll see my father with his hand on his favorite tree, looking up at it lovingly, adoringly. And like I said, the vultures circling overhead was a really, really, really powerful experience for all of us. So that's definitely captured in the photos. And on the last day of my trip, my father and I went for a long walk together, and he shared all his stories about the dictatorship. It took many, many, many hours. And we went for a walk on the sand dunes. And it was as though we were reenacting the vision that I had had of meeting him in the desert. And so there's a shot of him in the distance and of these tracks in the sand leading towards him. And I felt like I was capturing that vision of him. And what was really beautiful was that in reenacting this vision, unaware, like it was not our intention at all. So much healing took place because he's always been out of reach for me, and that was always a source of pain. And in that walk, he was right there. He was waiting for me. He would wait while I took photos, and then I would run up behind him and feel like I was a little girl again. So the natural world was very important. It held space for these experiences, and it offered up revelations. It showed us the path to follow, and it offered up a sense of freedom when I finally plunged into the ocean on the last day, at the end of our time together. Los Hermanos is still an incredibly important song to me. It reminds me of my ancestors and how I carry them within me, how we all do. And it makes me feel more connected to my family, even when we're far away. It speaks of us wandering the world darkened by solitude, finding ourselves in one another, and recognizing each other by a distant look in the eyes, by the verses that grip us and plant seeds of immensity within us. It's incredibly poetic. Ni Perdón Ni Olvido, the name of the intercultural, interdisciplinary forum on the experience of dictatorship, of which my exhibit is a part. We chose that title because it was the slogan of sorts throughout Latin America to remind people of the terrorism that they had suffered under the state. And it sounds harsh when you first hear it, right? You're like, no forgiveness, no forgetting. But the reality is, how can you ever forgive that? It was political genocide. There were thousands of people executed. There were hundreds of thousands of people exiled and tortured. How can you ever forgive that? My photos are an attempt to capture my family's stories and to share them. Actively encourage the remembering of these things so that these atrocities never happen again.
Yo tengo tantos hermanos que no los puedo contar. En el valle, en la montaña, en la pampa y en el mar.